Ranger in Time Journey Through Ash and Smoke. Chapter 14. Dangerous Crossing. Ranger, Helga, and her father climbed down from the cliffs. As Helga walked toward Rosta, she stepped on something and looked down to find her brooch that had torn loose and fallen. The iron was scuffed and scarred, and the pin had snapped off. Helga shivered, remembering how the brooch had bounced off the jagged rocks. She tucked the broken brooch into her sack. Then she looked at Ranger and bent to kiss the damp fur on his head. "Thank you," she whispered. Helga and her father mounted their horses and rode away from the crowds toward home. Helga carried Funi in the sling at her side again. Ranger trotted along beside them. It was slower than the ride here. Rain still poured from the gray sky and puddled between rocks along the path. The horses plodded through the mud. With every step, Helga's chest grew tighter with worry and impatience. Even with the long days of sunlight, they'd never make it home before night fell. She was thankful for the warmth of the fox pup. Father hadn't said a word when she scooped Funi up as she climbed back onto Rosta. She wasn't sure if he hadn't noticed or was too worried about her mother to care. As they traveled south and east, the sky darkened. At first, Helga was puzzled that night was falling so early. Then she realized it was the clouds, full of not only rain, but soot from the fire that shot up from the earth. The streams they crossed were thick with ash. Wet, gray dust made the rocks slick as ice. Ranger spread his toes to keep from skidding down the rocky bank of a creek. He'd learned to climb over slippery things in his search and rescue training with Luke and Dad. Luke had led him over all kinds of different surfaces. Plastic tarps and plywood covered with aluminum foil. Ranger had practiced walking up and down metal ladders at different slants, and that training helped him to steady himself on the slick rocks. But training had never lasted this long. When would he get to go home? The rain finally eased, but the sky was still dark with ashen clouds when they came to the last river crossing. Helga hesitated at the bank. She'd been skittish about crossing this deep, rocky water on the way to Thingvellir. Now the river was running higher and faster. She had to shout over the water to ask her father, "Is it safe to go on?" Ranger sniffed along the bank. This wasn't where he and Helga had crossed before. The current was faster here, and Ranger couldn't tell how deep the water might be. He whimpered and pawed at the rocks. Father hesitated too. He sat up taller on his horse and looked at the far bank. Helga knew he was thinking of Mother when he nodded briskly. "It's the only way back," he said, and started to urge his horse into the racing current. Ranger barked until Father stopped in the shallow water and looked back. Ranger raced along the bank of the river until he picked up Rosta's scent from before. It was faint and clouded by the rain and ash, but Ranger followed the scent trail down the river until he found the spot where they'd crossed. He barked again. "Father, wait!" Helga cried. She guided Rosta over the rocks and looked at the river where Ranger had stopped. It looked safer here, not as fast or deep. Father backed his horse out of the water and followed Helga to the new spot downstream. The river was still treacherous, but they made their way across. Ranger waited until they were safe on the far bank. He pawed the sooty mud. This river with its frothy current made his neck prickle, but Ranger knew he had to cross. He jumped from the bank, and the water swept him up before his paws even touched the rocky bottom. Ranger heard Helga shout something over the river's gushing roar. He paddled as hard as he could, trying to hold his chin over the rushing water. Finally, his paws found rock and mud. Ranger braced himself against the current and pushed to the far bank. He climbed out onto the slippery rocks and shook himself. Helga was way upstream, but she'd waited for him. Ranger made his way to her, and together they caught up with her father. The hills were scarred with landslides from the heavy rains. They rode through deeper and deeper ash as they approached the valley. "It's just over this ridge," Father said. His voice was hopeful, but the worry lines around his eyes made Helga's heart race. Mud and ash had already covered so much of the land. Would they arrive only to find the longhouse buried?